Donovan. I am refilming episode 25, which is the beginning of part 2, chapter 1 and part 2. Part 2 is God meets us in our bodies. Everything is sacrament. And chapter 1 is God meets us where we are, embodied in worship. In the biblical book of Psalms, the book of prayers and worship songs of the ancient Hebrews, worshipers proclaim, "How priceless is your unfailing love, O God! People take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house. You give them drink from your river of delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light we see light." That's Psalm 36. These 3 short verses express God acting to meet people's spiritual needs through so many material means and images. God is a refuge or a house that shelters us, as a physical dwelling shelters our bodies from the elements and from assault. We see by God's light, illuminating our vision and nourishing our growth in spiritual understanding, just as a plant grows in sunlight. And that image is also found in Psalm 18, 119, and 130, and in Ephesians 1. We taste as God comes to us as living water and spiritual bread. In this psalm, the focus is on living water. God feeds us both physically and spiritually and quenches our thirst physically and spiritually, not only to the point of full satisfaction, but delightfully, bringing us a surprising, spontaneous, and gratuitous sense of joy. Christians taste worship in a Lord's Supper of bread and wine, and many traditions have those rituals of eating and food offerings. These in the Christian tradition, this Lord's Supper commemorates Jesus' last Passover meal, the Seder, with his closest disciples. Excuse me. In the Passover Seder itself, too, Jewish people experience God's presence and faithfulness past and present. We touch, prayerfully delighted by God's presence as the fountain of life. Experienced by Christians, for example, when we practice baptism into covenant with Jesus and the church as disciples who pledge to follow Jesus daily in life, and in other beautiful, cleansing, renewing, nourishing water rituals in many other cultures and traditions. So the subsection I'm going to read today from this chapter is called Recovering Our Humanity and Interconnectedness in Baptism or Water Play. Baptism expresses its one kind of ritual and worship that uses the body. It's a sacrament in the Christian tradition. Baptism expresses a beautiful, intimate, committed, ongoing relationship. But to many people, maybe it comes across as an empty, traditional ritual or some kind of abstract theological symbol that no longer has meaning. Some of us may have observed baptism as a kind of rite of passage that celebrates the birth of an infant. It takes place in a church, but the people participating may not even be part of that community or that religious tradition. Baptism as just a rite of passage to welcome a new infant isn't really culturally relevant in the same way it may once have been in some cultures and times. Keeping state census and taxation records updated by issuing a birth certificate and related citizenship documents seems to be the most urgent priority to mark a new birth in the wider society now, at least in the US. And of course, there are some communities where there are other rituals, but in terms of the larger society, we don't necessarily do rites of passage as a wider culture. I know that makes sense, but hopefully it'll make sense as I go forward. So even though baptism can still be a way, or other types of rituals like that could still be a way to celebrate a birth, more deeply, for people who do practice baptism, it's not just this way to mark a new birth, but it's a moment of shared worship that celebrates an individual's belonging to this community and the community's belonging to them, connected by a common faith. In some traditions where infants are baptized, an additional worship experience may be practiced, confirmation, and that's often celebrated in connection with a coming of age, sort of rite of passage, for example, in relation to quinceañera. And that validates the individual's commitment to an understanding of the teachings of their spiritual community. Some who practice this form of worship emphasize God is doing all the work in this gift of water and community. No confession or work is required from the person who receives it. Others wait until an individual can seek and consent to this ritual, and they're emphasizing the transformation of life that flows from the individual's ongoing committed relationship with this community of faith and God that's expressed in the ceremony of baptism. Water is life. Many have told us so and continue to teach us. Like the grandmothers who teach and invite all other women to sing the Algonquin water song. And that's something you can look for on the internet. Grandmothers have given consent to participate in and shared this with anybody who's willing to learn it. So the importance of water and the sacredness of water is something that certainly transcends the Christian tradition. For right now, looking at what Jesus said in the Gospel of John, he recognizes water is life. Jesus describes himself as the fountain of living water. And he invites all who thirst to come and drink. In the 14th century, during the plague, the spiritual teacher Catherine of Siena explained Jesus' invitation this way. When the divine nature was joined with the human nature in the incarnation of Jesus, Jesus, became the fountain holding God, the source of living water. So Psalm 36 describes God, I quoted it earlier, as the fountain of life, a divine fountain with a river of delights from which God gives all people drink. Engaging these biblical images of God and Jesus as water, we can visualize baptism, no matter what form it takes, immersion, sprinkling, or pouring, as a dive or a jump, perhaps even a leap of, by, and into faith, into this living water, this godly river of delights to which God invites us. Ancient African church father Augustine of Hippo conjectured that there's a cleansing of the individual from systemic brokenness in these baptismal waters. That's really what's happening here. The baptismal waters are washing away a systemic kind of brokenness that we're just born into. When we immerse ourselves in these living waters through baptism, or even in prayer that's just reflecting on our life as baptized people, we can experience God so deeply that God's own image in us is restored. So Augustine believed. And what Augustine was talking about has often been translated original sin. And that's a phrase that's been misunderstood in a shaming and guilt-ridden way, a way that a lot of people aren't comfortable with or have walked away from or pushed away. But I want to share that Martin Luther King Jr. reclaimed that understanding. A lot of people who do anti-racist work have reclaimed that as a way to talk about, for example, Jim Wallace talks about America's original sins of racism and militarism and capitalism. So original sin sometimes can be a sort of a spiritual way of framing systemic violence and systemic injustice. In other words, it's not something I created, it's something I'm born into and participate in, not entirely voluntarily, but it's definitely affecting my life. So I just want to go back to the words of Martin Luther King about this. It may be more useful to talk about this instead of as original sin, which, because of problematic way it's understood. I don't usually use that. I don't use that phrase. I'll just point blank say it. I don't use that phrase. So I'll talk about systemic injustice or systemic violence, but I'm drawing on the teachings of Martin Luther King and other people who have applied his teachings since then. King says, it's very seldom that a man by himself will lynch anybody, but a mob will lynch somebody. Individual men won't do the things that a nation will do. The real tragedy of man's social and collective existence is the fact that sin is almost inescapable in this level. Because you are involved in society and you're necessarily a part of the sins of society, you can't quite break off. So if we use King's way of describing this to understand what Augustine was saying about baptism, this is where we get a chance, a hope to be freed into a different way of life than just the one that our society has constructed for us. For those of us, for example, who are born into any kind of unearned social privileges of any kind, we can be humbled and hopeful that continuous interconnection with God and beloved community can restore the image of God in us once again. In spite of colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, cis heteronormativity, those do not have the final word in defining who we are. God has the power to restore us to being a person among people, no greater and no lower than any other. One of God's beloved children, no less, no more. And we keep reconnecting with that right-sized, interconnected, healed way of being in continual spiritual practices and community. In other words, what I was trying to say there is by engaging in community, by being part of community and continuing ongoing spiritual practice, that's how we can keep that image of God in us shining clearly and not get caught up in the web of violence and systemic injustice. It's continuous work. It's not a one-time done deal, but it gives us hope. Perhaps God clears that channel of love and light in us that may have been muddied by self-neglect or by collective and personal trauma, including systemic violence and injustice. Or perhaps like a mirror that Spirit has cleaned and polished, we reflect that image of God even more clearly. If we visualize ourselves at times, even just splashing about innocently in this living water, God's presence, without clear direction, just like children wading in cool shallows on a hot day or blowing bubbles, Spirit invites us to experience baptism and prayer as a form of play and delight in the living waters of God that refreshes us. In baptism and renewed life afterward, God refreshes us. There it is. God refreshes us with this living water over and over and over again, buoyantly holds us on this river of delights as we rest and float on God's being. God's being so much denser and stronger than our own. And God quenches our deep spiritual thirst, just as Jesus promised in Gospel of John, chapter 7. I think it is. After baptism, an individual continues to respond freely to God's gift by growing and maturing in godly love. We hold our spiritual cup in this living fountain, not only so that we can drink of God's fountain of love for ourselves, but more importantly, so that we can share this living water with anyone else who thirsts. Even living through and after the plague, the mystic Catherine of Siena, pouring herself out, caring for those who were sick and hungry, exclaimed of her own experience of the presence of this living water flowing through her, "No sooner is your vessel emptied than it is filled." Prayerful reflection on our, in connection to, not just reflecting on it, it's not just in our minds, it's really doing movements with our body, maybe splashing in water or drinking water, connecting to our relationship with God, and I'm going to say living water, and with other people, helps us keep this overflowing cup of love always replenished in the divine river of delights so that we never have to run dry. When we draw from or channel this living fountain of God, we can give to others, not just out of our own limited human resources. We can continually draw and be replenished from God's own infinite abundance of love. Our cup runneth over. The power of the living water in baptism, in prayer, in sacred reading, in living service reminds us that we are not in control, that we cannot fix what is broken in ourselves. We can't restore that image of God in us ourselves. We can't remove our entanglement from systemic violence through our own efforts. That's the gift of baptism. What it reminds us that there's a living source, living waters that restore us no matter how dry we may feel, no matter how overwhelming the injustice and violence around and within us. The dry times do not define us. In prayer, in community, in sacramental embodied practices, God reminds us that we are not alone and that we may yet still be a channel of everlasting love.